It's a strategy Nintendo has used before to great effect, and now I think it could be a potent part of their development toolkit in the new generation, allowing them to leverage their existing catalogue of titles while still providing brand new experiences alongside. I'm talking about what I'm going to call plus games. Bowser's Fury, Four Swords, Xenoblade Chronicles Future Connected Mode, Bowser Jr.'s Journey. None of these began as discrete games in their own right, but rather were bolted on to remakes or remasters of existing marquee titles to give an old title fresh appeal. And while we've seen a few examples in recent years, I think this option has huge potential for Nintendo as we move into the post-Switch era. We're going to look at the current examples and examine the effect the plus game approach has had, then explore some games and franchises where a plus title might be the perfect next step. Now, of course, there are lots of examples of remasters and remakes on Nintendo where the game has been zhuzhed up, but this falls short of a full extra game mode. Some nicer graphics maybe, a few extra modes. I can think of no better or more successful example than the Switch's own Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which added a few mild modes to the Wii U title to give it a lift. Of course, eventually, Nintendo went a lot further, adding not just a new mode, but a late-in-life extra set of courses, which allowed Mario Kart 8 Deluxe to now boast double the base game's courses and 3 times the number of courses from the Wii U's base version of the game. What I'm discussing in this video is closer in spirit to the Booster Course DLC in scale, except even then this is not quite the same thing, since even though this title was originally a different game, most of the tracks after all come from Mario Kart Tour, it falls into the groove of what the original game was trying to offer and crucially markets itself primarily as a continuation of the original rather than something experimental and new in addition. What I'm talking about is a discrete game being added. Sure, one that reutilizes assets and is a smaller version compared to the original, but also one that is innovative and experimental and memorable in its own right. The most infamous example of this in recent years is Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, and there's been quite a long tradition of Nintendo bolting on smaller titles to an existing game before this. Just on Switch, we have Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition and Future Connected, which brings the original Xenoblade Chronicle levels with its 2 successor titles in having a smaller sequel mode. But Mario actually has a fair history of this. Remember how the Mario and Luigi titles, Superstar Saga and Bowser's Inside Story, had sequel games attached to their 3DS remakes, Bowser's Minions and Bowser Jr.'s Journey. Now, the latter example may not exactly feel like a rainbow over the Mushroom Kingdom, given that remake's dire sales and the subsequent implosion of developers' Alpha Dream, but I think there was a very good reason for the extra mode, specifically that these were remakes of games that were already compatible with the 3DS hardware. Partners in Time and Bowser's Inside Story had both released on the Nintendo DS, and the interval between the games was also quite short, only 8 or 9 years. This is a similar pattern, of course, to Super Mario 3D World, which was just over 7 years old when it was re-envisioned, and Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, which was 10 years old but had already seen one remake on the new 3DS just a few years prior. Basically, Nintendo likes to remake games and sweat their assets, and when you have games on very different hardware where the original install base was small and where the pressure to issue games to fill scheduling gaps is high, then a new funky mode of the sort that marked out Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze may be acceptable. And of course, we still get plenty of remakes, remasters and ports that don't make any significant changes to the gameplay, let alone add on extra modes. Just in recent months, we've had Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, with Donkey Kong Country Returns HD just around the corner. However, Nintendo does have a track record of trying to bolt experimental concepts on. Let's look at Zelda games. Link's Awakening has been remade twice, and while the first expansion for Game Boy Color simply added a fun but fairly disposable extra dungeon to justify using color, the Switch version bolted on an extra Dungeon Maker mode. Now, this was very much a small-scale offering, and its reception was not necessarily the warmest. Personally, I think it's fun to mess around with now and then, especially if you have the Link's Awakening Link amiibo, but it's far from a fully formed game. However, as a canary down the dungeon, it makes a lot of sense. Mario Maker had been very successful on the Wii U around the time that Link's Awakening was starting development, and there was a lot of excitement about the possibility of a Zelda equivalent of that game. However, clearly developing dungeons is a much more complex and tricky task than designing Mario levels, and so developing a small version of this concept made sense. And the thing is, what's often forgotten is that Link's Awakening was not the starting point of the project, as Eiji Aonuma recounted to IGN in 2019. I talked to Mr. Miyamoto regularly about the next Zelda game, and one time he asked me if I could come up with a game that features Super Mario Maker-like gameplay, but for Zelda. We talked about how a game like this for Zelda would have dungeons, but it's generally quite difficult to devise the logic needed to solve them. Because of that inherent difficulty, they thought about how to take the spirit of that gameplay and create something more approachable for audiences. So we gave some thought into a more approachable style of play where you have to think about how to arrange parts that already have a solution to create a single dungeon, instead of allowing players to create complex arrangements like Super Mario Maker 2. And that's how we created the chamber dungeons for this game. In fact, the game could easily have been a different title other than Link's Awakening, but the choice to revive the Game Boy masterpiece was made because the dungeon rooms were smaller and more modular and better fit the kind of modular piece-by-piece building that Aonuma envisioned than other Zelda titles he could have chosen. Quoting the IGN interview once more, Aonuma said, "Given that the Chamber Dungeons feature is based on using rooms that already have a solution, we went looking for examples from existing titles and found that the dungeons in The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening would be the most suitable because each room is usually the size of a single screen, and seen from a top-down view, this makes their layout easy to understand. A critical part of the Chamber Dungeon gameplay is understanding the original dungeons before arranging your own." Let's be honest, even if they expanded the chamber dungeons drastically, it's difficult to imagine a Zelda Maker of this style standing alone as a game, but by stapling it to a surefire success like Link's Awakening, the creative team got to try their hand at something and see what the reaction was. And indeed, they used their learning from that title as the starting point for Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, with the idea that in that game you could make your own dungeons, a concept which remained in place for some time until the developers, as they like to say, upended the tea table and came up with a subtly different approach. But Nintendo has a deep history of this kind of thing. It's not just something that's emerged in recent years. Notably, the Game Boy Advance release of A Link to the Past included a standalone mode which cannibalizes many of the same assets but utilizes a completely different gameplay concept, in this case, multiplayer Zelda. And just as with Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom, the experience of Four Swords proved instructive in developing the fuller Four Swords adventure title for GameCube. So look, Nintendo does create additional smaller titles to bolt on to its existing remakes and remasters. Let's call these plus titles. But this is rare, and I would suggest that there are a few specific circumstances we can identify for when these games emerge. Firstly, if they are putting out a remake where a significant portion of their new audience may have already played the original title. This was the case with A Link to the Past, which, although on different hardware, was the 7th most successful Super NES game, and it was certainly the case with the 3DS Mario and Luigi ports. But this is usually a factor in most games with additional features, such as the extra modes on recent ports, such as Kirby Return to Dreamland and Pikmin 3 Deluxe, and and of course Xenoblade Chronicles' third release in a decade, necessitating something more to sweeten the deal. We can also see, as with Link's Awakening and perhaps Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, that they might also use these games as a kind of proof of concept for something they're developing in the future, a smaller, prototypical version of a potential future game, making it a useful way to test out concepts that they are not yet fully sure they want to invest large amounts into. Of course, the reason that this is relevant now is that the Nintendo Switch has a very large amount of games which achieved some level of success, but which will be forward compatible with future hardware, and yet they could, under the right circumstances, be re-released alongside new Plus games. The ideal version of this to me would be if the additional modes were available as high-end DLC, allowing owners of the original titles to simply upgrade, although it would of course depend on the types of changes being offered. I don't think every title would be eligible for this though. Another key consideration in favour of Nintendo going for a Plus title is that there would be no original title in the series available on a new system when the Plus title launches. Minish Cap was still a way off when A Link to the Past plus Four Swords dropped, most obviously. In the case of Bowser's Fury and Future Connected, these titles filled a long gap in their respective franchises, 3.5 years after Super Mario Odyssey and 2.5 years after Xenoblade Chronicles 2. This allowed Nintendo to keep these franchises alive and kicking with new content without committing the same scale of resources as a whole new entry would require. We've seen this in different ways, of course, with the way that Luigi's Mansion, Paper Mario, and Donkey Kong Country have returned for second helpings on Switch around 4 or so years after their prior titles, enough time to ensure that most people who wanted to play the original higher effort titles had purchased them, but still allowing them to meet demand for those franchises and keep up awareness. What this means is that I would not expect to see a Mario Kart 8 Deluxe plus Bowser's Road Rage. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has had an incredible run, but a new Mario Kart has to be the order of the day sooner or later. Similarly, I would not expect to see a 3D Mario title reutilizing old material right now, although as I've mentioned before in my recent video on Nintendo software technology, I could imagine a Super Mario Galaxy 2 plus Bowser's Nebula being a great way to both revive an underloved title and to give it a new lease of life. Or potentially in 3 or 4 years, a 10th, 11th anniversary version of Super Mario Odyssey with a Plus game attached to that, re-released to ensure that another generation gets to enjoy one of the premier titles of the Switch era. However, I do think there are titles which have far more potential, and I've mentioned some in recent videos, such as the prospect of a remade Donkey Kong Jungle Beat which had an extra game mode, a way to test the waters of returning to Donkey Kong without going to quite the trouble of creating a whole new game from scratch. Still, while I feel this is plausible, I think there are likelier options. Firstly, let's look at Yoshi's Woolly World. The most likely future for this title, it seems to me, is to follow in the footsteps of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. The Great Ape had a Wii and a 3DS version of his 2010 adventure, and integrating both sets of content allowed for the game to feel fairly new. Woolly World also has a Wii U and a 3DS version, and with 5 years having nearly elapsed since the last Switch Yoshi title, and Yoshi being the kind of title focused on a younger demographic that would particularly suit the aging original Switch as it becomes the cheaper, child or casual focused console, I could see an argument that a bare bones transition would be more than enough for that title. However, if it does return, I do think there's an outside chance, maybe 30%, that we would see substantial new additions from developers Goodfeel. You see, these guys have recently had 2 big games released, Princess Peach Showtime for Nintendo and their own independent project Bakaru. All things being equal, it will be a long time before they are able to put out a title of equivalent scale on the Switch successor, unless of course they make a smaller game and append it to their most acclaimed Nintendo title of recent years. It also seems to me that Yoshi and Poochie have a particular appeal in Japan, with 4.5 million viewers on Nintendo's Japanese YouTube checking out Nintendo's bespoke animations for the franchise, and 4.2 million checking out another video in that series. That's more than Splatoon 3, Luigi's Mansion 3, Pokemon Legends Arceus, and other videos accrued in views, although less than the Pikmin movies, which are still Nintendo of Japan's most popular YouTube videos. Reportedly, Pooch's Amiibo was a particularly obscure one in Japan as well, suggesting a high level of popularity. Still, we are overdue a Yoshi game, and it has presumably been held back from a Switch port for a reason, so it does seem to me plausible that we could see a more substantial return to the Woolly World. Another option in the Plus Games vein is Star Fox. Look, Star Fox Zero has its critics, and while remakes of both Star Fox Assault and Star Fox Adventures seem to be popular options with the fan base, if there is any franchise which seems to need some kind of fresh experimental thinking, it seems to be Star Fox. But that could be a very expensive experiment if it were a full new game. So what about doing a smaller scale experimental test game title as a side mode? I guess Star Fox Zero might be the easier one to port, given the relatively strong graphics of the Wii U, and with reworked controls, it might be more optimistically received. Negativity about the prior control scheme didn't stop the return of Skyward Sword, although I grant you that even the original Wii Skyward Sword that humiliated Shigeru Miyamoto on the E3 stage was never remotely as reviled as Star Fox Zero often still is. But if you want to give a new team a chance to try something, Star Fox Zero plus Star Fox 1 might be an interesting take. Quite what the extra game could be, I wouldn't begin to guess, but that's the charm of these add-on games. In an era where big studios are splurging squillions on new titles despite not even knowing if there's a strong audience for the gameplay, Nintendo could test the waters before committing and would help train up a new team into the bargain potentially. Kirby devs HAL would benefit from this kind of situation as well. While previously they had other development partners like Vanpool and Goodfeel backing their play, in recent times they've been shouldering development solo. Return to Dreamland Deluxe has already played around with extra modes, so it's a small jump from that to an extra bolt-on game. Kirby has many acclaimed prior titles, such as Planet Robobot and Triple Deluxe, and while a flat-out port of either would do fine, HAL could make the titles feel more consequential by adding a side mode. Incidentally, I'm just cutting into my original script here to note that the very well-connected Nate the Hate, in his recent podcast, tipped a Planet Robobot port for Switch. If the plan is indeed for a late in-life Switch release, I would therefore expect a more straight-up port instead of a full Fat Plus title being added on. But if they saved such an acclaimed title for the early days of the Switch 2, all bets could be off. Complicating matters, of course, is that the Switch 2 is backwards compatible, so in this sense, perhaps there's no difference in launching a big game now, but I still think Nintendo will want to safeguard their future shelf space by making titles on the Switch 2 have more staying power. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, in particular, after Forgotten Land, there's a huge hunger for both more 3D and 2D Kirby, and it would make sense to develop one type of title. Probably a 3D game, given Forgotten Land's outsized success, while having a small and experimental plus title on an existing game alongside. One thing I will say that possibly mitigates against Kirby having such an experimental title is that the franchise is no stranger to smaller downloadable entries, and so it's more likely that HAL would be able to experiment and try something different without needing to attach it to an existing game, as of course they did with Kirby's Dream Buffet, among many other experimental outings. More controversially, a title that could return with a plus mode could be Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I think everybody is expecting a new Smash title to either cut its losses with the vast roster of previous characters and stages and reboot, or else try to build on the existing foundations. But another option is that they could do neither and instead take on a sideways mode. What if Masahiro Sakurai decided that he truly was done with Super Smash Bros. With Sora's 2021 debut, and so instead of trying to reboot it himself or tweak Ultimate, the complete version of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate was released on the new system as a game in its own right, ported to the new system as a complete edition. However, added to that, we could see a new mode, some complete departure from Masahiro Sakurai, or indeed an experimental mode from a new team of Nintendo developers, perhaps with Sakurai keeping only a weather eye on proceedings. If this new mode turned out to be a disaster, it wouldn't matter quite so much, as it would only be a side mode on an already popular title that would surely continue to sell at a trickle. But if it were successful, it could map out the contours of Super Smash Bros.' future. This would then give Nintendo the opportunity to take a few years developing a second Smash title for the new system and release that towards the second half of the system's life. Major Nintendo titles don't always get 2 games on a console, but plenty do. Just in this generation, we've seen Mario, Zelda, and Splatoon all have early and late era entries in their gaming canons, and an experimental Smash sequel would justify being a second entry, and in many ways, Year 5 or Year 6 might be a better time for such an experimental Smash game. Even if Sakurai devotees swear off the product, the high initial install base of the system will carry it to initial success, and there is less risk launching a product like this towards the end of a system's life than there would be in Year 1 or Year 2, where negative press from fans of Ultimate could put people off adopting the system in the first place. I don't necessarily think this is a very likely option, but I don't think it's completely impossible either, so about a 10% chance maybe. But there are more obvious candidates for upgrade games. There's one series that is unlikely to have any original representation for at least 3 or 4 years, and that is The Legend of Zelda. Now, I'm a big booster for the concept of an Ocarina of Time remake, and I still feel that this is a strong chance. It's the 3D title that has had the longest time since a re-release. It has huge marquee appeal, although its name recognition and the potential for a far more substantial remake is huge. Plus, Eiji Aonuma made the kind of obscure hints about Ocarina of Time, such as wondering how many people remembered Rauru and giving a laughing no comment to a direct question about it, reminiscent of past hints such as his musing about whether you could make a game where you played as a thief a few years before Link's Awakening returned. However, if Ocarina of Time does return, I would expect it to be far more thorough a reimagining than we've seen with previous Zelda remasters. Interviewed in 2009 by Spanish outlet El Mundo, Aonuma-san commented, and I'm using Google Translate to go from Spanish, even though he was originally speaking Japanese, so take the specific wording with a pinch of salt, but he said, "Also, things from the past go into our memories and become bigger and bigger. If you play Ocarina of Time now, you realize that it's not such a good game. There are moments when it doesn't move as fast as it should, the graphics aren't as pretty as they should be, there are some confusing parts. Nowadays, any Zelda is technically superior. Everything goes much faster, much better. But to overcome that Zelda from Ocarina of Time, what is needed is to bring a change comparable to what was experienced at that time, and that will be quite difficult." Of course, it didn't stop him from bringing back Ocarina of Time to the 3DS a couple of years later, but it still seems conceivable, especially given how dissatisfied he seems to have been with the more linear approach to Zelda in recent times, that he takes a more radical approach to remaking Ocarina of Time, especially since it may well be the first remake to launch on the new system, which is already available in its original form on Nintendo Switch Online, making a more simple graphical uplift arguably a little redundant. But because of this, I don't see Ocarina of Time as a good candidate for a Plus game. On the other hand, other games may benefit from this kind of approach. Wind Waker and Twilight Princess already have side mode titles, which could be ready-made bolt-ons. In Twilight Princess's case, the same graphics were used for Link's crossbow training, which could make a nice extra mode, while Wind Waker also has expansion potential without doing anything brand new. The Four Swords Adventure Japanese edition had Wind Waker-style spin-off minigame called Navi Trackers. This is a small scavenger hunt game that stars Tetra and multicolored links, and although most of the actual games themselves are rendered in 2D, it seems like it would be possible to take this idea and adapt it into the Wind Waker engine to create a new side mode that would encourage multiplayer action. Still, the odds of doing full side mode games for Wind Waker or Twilight Princess also seem remote. It's true that, as the third versions of these games, it would make some sense to give them something substantial and new when re-releasing them. But it would be an extensive project to make something new in these gameplay modes. Granted, Bowser's Fury, although it lifted some elements from 3D World, was fairly radically different, but Wind Waker already has a sequel in the form of Phantom Hourglass. I'm just not sure, therefore, I see these games as suiting plus game additions at this point. No, the games that really would benefit from this kind of thing are Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Why? Well, look, firstly, these games were absolutely monster hits, and even if you allow that Tears of the Kingdom has yet to match Breath of the Wild's impact, it still sold 20 million in a matter of weeks, which is better than a poke in the eye with a Boko stick. These games also involved very substantial development time, especially around creating the mechanics. Tears of the Kingdom built substantially on the groundwork that Breath of the Wild had laid down, not least the world of the game, and I can understand why Nintendo might have felt in 2023 that they didn't want to return to the Hyrule of the Wild through DLC or any further expansion. They had given it a good tilt, and the time had come for something new. Hidemaru Fujibashi did allude in an interview to having an idea of what that next game might be, but at that stage he had yet to talk about it to Eiji Aonuma, meaning that back then the next Zelda was so embryonic it was barely even zygotic. Just one of the reasons why I think we could be in for a very substantial wait still for the next open-air Zelda. But what if Nintendo could have a plus version of Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom? And at this point, I think Tears of the Kingdom probably has the better claim, since it has lower existing sales and a more developed set of game mechanics, although of course you could make counter arguments in favour of Breath of the Wild as well, due to it being an older title. Why would they do this though? Firstly, it offers the chance to experiment. We haven't had a true multiplayer Zelda since Triforce Heroes, and these games have never performed hugely well compared to the rest of the series. Still, Aonuma-san has often referred to his interest in multiplayer, and in an era where Nintendo has its own online infrastructure, the potential of a multiplayer Zelda has to have significant possibilities. It could be that this simply reutilizes for a third time the map of the wild, but I think after a gap of 2 or more years, it's quite plausible that we could see a substantial new game map built using the existing mechanics. Reportedly, the actual creation of the game map in Breath of the Wild didn't take nearly as long as the developing of the complex chemistry system, and for Tears of the Kingdom, they created the depths even more quickly, it seems, by inverting the map of the surface game and by adding bits on top of that. Populating a large open world with interesting features can be time-consuming, but a multiplayer game means that the game would be less reliant on having Addison around every corner struggling with a sign. Just as Nintendo are reportedly exploring a Roblox or Minecraft-like experience, the other low-hanging fruit has long been their own take on a Fortnite-style game, and while I don't imagine that this would be a starting point for Nintendo's creative processes, the potential of the Hyrule of the Wild to create a multiplayer survival-type game can't have escaped Nintendo's notice whether or not they choose ultimately to act on it. As Future Connected added the Bionis' shoulder, there are locations within sight of the Hyrule of the Wild just itching to be explored if only the chasm could be breached, while Nintendo could just go the Koholint Island route and create something utterly off the wall and different, but reutilizing elements from what went before. Because Tears of the Kingdom was built with multiplicative gameplay in mind, each concept interacting discreetly with every other concept in the game to create a vast array of gameplay options, it's possible that just 1 or 2 experimental features could give us a smaller but still hugely engaging Zelda experience. But while experimentation is one of the key motivations for such a game, the other would be to build a secondary Zelda team. Think about it, for a long time we've had 2 concurrent Zelda teams. Daiki Aramoto's 2D team were bringing regular games to the DS, while Hidemaru Fujibashi took over the mainline Zelda team from 2011's Skyward Sword onward. With Grezzo now stepping up as the regular guardians of 2D top-down Zelda, Aonuma-san has been frank that he expects more top-down Zelda titles in the future, but this was required principally because of the increase in scale of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which sucked in so much talent, including Iramoto-san. But there are still people, like the aforementioned Iwamoto-san, who was the director of the Breath of the Wild Champions Ballad DLC, who might still be trusted to take on a game in their own right, to say nothing of new, hungry creators from the now much expanded Tears of the Kingdom team. If we take Fujibashi-san at his word that he only had early ideas of the new game in 2023, that entire Zelda expertise base would be scattered to the wind until or unless the Zelda team had a new project to bring them back together. Now, many Nintendo EPD developers do work on other projects, of course, and if the Zelda team were ramping up a side project like an Ocarina of Time game, that would also make sense as a way to direct the members of the Zelda team who are waiting for the new full Zelda project to ramp up. But I think there's also great potential from an original project led by a younger team, which is smaller in scope and scale. Eiji Aonuma asked the Hall of Grezzo for their ideas for the game that became Echoes of Wisdom, but what would happen if you asked a younger generation of developers who had only ever worked at Nintendo on Zelda's Wild titles to break out of the mold and do something really different? Of course, there are drawbacks to this idea. Tears of the Kingdom may not have sold Breath of the Wild numbers, but it did huge business nonetheless, and an extra game mode could be risky. Still, as a stopgap project before a new title, it strikes me as making a lot of sense, as well as being a likely crowd pleaser. It's even possible that such an addition could be saved for much further down the track. Nintendo couldn't have known just how evergreen Mario Kart 8 Deluxe would be, and it must have struck them as a possibility that they might want to launch a whole new Mario Kart later in the life of the Switch if their original title ever showed signs of flagging. They could do this since Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was, after all, air quotes, only a port. But as it turned out, they didn't need to do this. By cannibalizing Mario Kart Tour content into Deluxe, they were able to keep it racing for another few years and have bought themselves loads of time to absolutely perfect the next Mario Kart. Imagine if 6 years from now the next Zelda is still a long way off being done. Would Nintendo panic and rush it to the shelves? No, that's hugely unlikely given how dedicated they are to quality. They've done it before with titles like Wind Waker, of course, but it's not really ended well for them. Instead, though, what if they could do a plus version of Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom in, let's say, 2028, giving a bit of breathing room until their new full title is finished? It would not be the perfect option, but as they say, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Still, while Zelda is another option that I could see getting a Plus game, most of the Plus titles have been in the Mario universe, and that's why I think a low-key shot for such a sequel could be Super Mario Bros. Wonder. This might seem odd in some respects. EPD10, the developers, managed to bring out both a whole new Super Mario Bros. Title and a Pikmin sequel in 2023, albeit with a bit of help from their friends at Achting to deliver on Pikmin. 2D Mario is a huge seller for Nintendo, with even the rather tepidly received new Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe regularly in the top 10 best-selling Switch games. Yes, Wonder took 11 years to gestate, but that was because the team was distracted by Super Mario Maker and its sequel. Why wouldn't they give a full, fat successor title to Super Mario Bros. Wonder? Well, for one thing, innovation is tricky, and while I think EPD10 does very likely have the capacity to develop a new 2D Mario alongside the next Pikmin, Pikmin, by the way, a title surely likely for the first few years of the new system's life, given what a fuss Nintendo of Japan are making about them, it's not necessarily the case that EPD10 can turn around a new Mario Bros. Title quite so quickly. Wonder, on the other hand, is selling well, very well, but its shelf life could potentially be curtailed by being on aging hardware, and even if it's put into holiday bundles in some regions, it's unlikely to bring it up to the level of new Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe's sales, at least in the short term. But what if you could bolt on a new mode, a major DLC for Switch players, but a true experimental departure for everyone else? I have to say, I have long reflected on whether or not an open-world Bowser's Fury style game could be created in the 2D Mario space. It would feel, I guess, more like a Mario Metroidvania with a huge open map Mario and probably Wonder Effect gradually reworking the world around the Portly Plumber. I don't think such a game will be needed in 2025. Aside from Mario's 40th anniversary coming up, we are almost guaranteed, 90% maybe, new 3D Mario and new Mario Kart by the end of March 2026, the end of the anniversary window. But come 2026 or 2027, it could be time for a more experimental take on 2D Mario. And while in theory, any of the past 2D Marios could be resurrected, a remade Super Mario Bros. 3 or Super Mario World with an extra major mode would doubtless create ripples, despite the originals being on NSO even now. Wonder seems like the most ripe to flower. Another option, of course, would be Super Mario Maker 2. In this case, since the titles are more iterative in approach to start with, I would not expect a Super Mario Maker 2 plus Bowser's Fascia, since there would be no real reason not to at least brand it as Super Mario Maker 3. But if the 2D team did still want to keep the Maker games alive, a Wonder Plus re-release would give them the blessing of some breathing room. Unlikely perhaps, 10% maybe, but not probably completely impossible. So look, what are the chances of any new Plus title? Given that we've seen a handful of them in the last decade, I think the likelihood of one by the end of 2027 has to be around 70%. Whether names Plus like the Mario titles or differently titled future connected style bolt-on games, or a Plus in name only add-on where a completely different mode is stitched onto the base game, as in the case of Link's Awakening. Generally, I think the distinction has to be that the new Plus game has its own title distinct from the original, but of course this can still be tricky to identify, as there are plenty of modes within existing games that have their own titles, think World of Light. So I guess this will be a tricky one to identify, but hopefully we won't have to be guessing too long. Still, let me know what you would expect to see from Nintendo's game development arm, and do check out my previous video on why Nintendo seems to have gone cold on DLC. Thanks for watching, thanks so much to my Patreon supporters as ever, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.